Good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege. My name is Alexandre Verheyden from Jones Day, based in Brussels, to chair this panel on the state of play of the implementation of the EU toolbox for 5G security. This is a very hot topic at the moment, and it's really a pleasure for me to be chairing this panel this afternoon. So thank you very much to the organizers for their invitation. To cover this topic, we have three very distinguished panelists. And if you allow me, I will introduce them first, and then we will start with everyone's views. We have planned this as a relatively informal exercise, so they will answer to some of my questions. And you also have the option, you, the audience, to ask questions, and we will address them to the best of our ability when they are sent to us by um, the centralized services of the organizers. Our first speaker is Michel van Billigen. So Michel is a lawyer by background. He has done most of his career for the government in different capacity, and for most of it in the technological space. Michel, you were advisor to the Minister of Telecommunications at some stage. You have worked for BIPT, the Belgian regulator, in many different capacity, and more recently, so you are the president of BIPT. At the same time, you are the upcoming chair of BEREC, and you've been invited in that capacity. So we're very much looking forward to having your views on what can BEREC do and what's its role in the context of this implementation of the EU toolbox. Our second speaker this afternoon is Andreas Konen. Andreas, you are a mathematician by background, but you have moved away, or to some extent, from that field. You joined the Federal Office of Information Security, BSI, in 2006. Today, you are the Director General of that office. And I think it's fair to say that there are not that many people in Germany who know more about cybersecurity than you. So we're very happy to have you on this panel. Our third speaker this afternoon is Sara Bussière. What we wanted to do is also have the benefit of the experience of an operator present in many different countries. And Sara, you've been working for Orange for more than 20 years now, again in different capacity, which gives you a fairly broad overview and knowledge of your group. You were at some stage head of commercial roaming and interconnect. More recently, the last 3 years, you've been based in Brussels, focusing on cybersecurity and privacy. Now, before I open the floor, I wanted to say a few words about the EU toolbox itself. Now, 5G cybersecurity is very hot at the moment. Now, it's not the first time that the issue of network security has arisen. Before 5G, we had 2G, 3G, 4G, and at all time, network security was a source of concern and has been addressed from a regulatory point of view. Now, so far, up until the EU toolbox, most of the measures, of course, it's an issue which rests largely upon member states, but the regulation was coordinated at the EU level to some extent. Most of it was so far regulated by the regulation of electronic communications and its most recent embodiment in the European Electronic Communications Code. In addition to that, you've had other instruments that have been adopted at the EU level, the NIS directive, which requires operators of essential services in different sectors, energy, finance, healthcare, and the like, to take appropriate security measures for their services and networks, and to notify serious incidents. And we also have had at the EU level the regulation on Cybersecurity Act, which provides for a framework for cybersecurity certification scheme. So you've had a fair amount of legislative intervention at the EU level, which by definition draws on member states' ability to take the adequate measures. because at the end of the day, cybersecurity is also very largely a matter of national enforcement. But the EU toolbox is a slight deviation from those prescriptive or normative intervention at the EU level, because what has happened for the 5G for the EU toolbox is that it's more of a soft law approach, a catalog of measures that has been defined by the European Commission in cooperation and on the basis of risk assessments done at the national level, and which has resulted in the definition of a number of catalog of measures. Some of them are labeled as strategic measures, other are more labeled as technical measures, but it's a combination of measures which are which are made available at the national level to regulators and to member states, among which they can pick and choose what is appropriate in view of the domestic need of each country. So that's the approach of the EU toolbox. And in this regard, it is more of a soft law approach than a normative approach that we had seen at play in other community or European Union legislative instruments. Now, without any further ado, I would like to ask my first question to Michel, which is really, what is it that BEREC can do in relation to 5G, to the implementation of the 5G cybersecurity toolbox?
Thank you very much, Alexandre, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michel Van Mellingen, BIPT Chairman and BEREC Incoming Chair 2021. What is BEREC? BEREC is the body of European regulators for electronic communications. So BEREC is committed to the development of secure 5G networks in Europe. And indeed, 5G has been one of BEREC's key priorities for several years now. What is BEREC's responsibilities? So it includes developing common positions and guidelines to ensure consistent applications on the regulatory framework in electronic communications. And we in BEREC also produce reports on technical matters. So from our perspective, we need to take into consideration rapidly changing markets like AI, 5G, IoT on the one hand, and strategic policy developments on the other hand, especially the priorities of the European Commission. So we are experts in telecommunications markets, but not necessarily in cybersecurity. Few BEREC members are in charge of cybersecurity, but some of them are in charge of network security. Yet 5G security aspects cannot be overlooked in our work. And so we don't do this isolated, but in cooperation with other institutions such as ENISA. So you know that 2020 represents the year of 5G spectrum award process. But in reality, according to the 5G Observatory, only about 20% of the spectrum available for 5G has been awarded so far. Why is it so? Well, there is a couple of hurdles that tend to slow down the 5G award process. Some countries have postponed the auctions due to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, but there is also an increasing amount of disinformation regarding 5G, fear regarding emissions, and of course, discussions on the security requirements. So security is for BEREC a key consideration from a business perspective. That's why we in BEREC established last year a dedicated workflow regarding 5G cyber security. Now, more specifically about the toolbox, where are we now? Well, even before the adoption of the toolbox and following the recommendation published by the Commission in March last year, BEREC assisted actively the toolbox development process within the NIS cooperation group and a commission. So we gather information and we shared our experience on electronic communications market. Furthermore, BEREC wants to assess the market impact of 5G cybersecurity measures and report it to this NIS cooperation group. So, as you mentioned, the toolbox, the 5G toolbox adopted in January has identified 3 categories of measure: strategic measures, tactical measures, and supporting actions. For BEREC members, the strategic measures are the most relevant for NRA's work and experiences. So work is still ongoing in close dialogue with institutions and the sector, and currently BEREC is specifically focusing on the issue of diversification of suppliers. This is one of the key measures in the 5G toolbox. The objective of this measure is obvious. Implementing a working multi-vendor strategy should avoid or limit dependency on a single supplier and should avoid dependency on suppliers considered to be high-risk vendors. So in this perspective, it is crucial to understand the term multi-vendor strategy the same way and to have a correct overview of existing network footprints in terms of suppliers per type of network and the origin of the supplier. Because operators themselves are first in line to ensure security, they need to include timely the security requirements in their 5G procurement plans. And this is also relevant in a pan-European perspective on how the restriction in a member state could have an effect on the selection of suppliers in other member states. So BEREC will also aim to investigate if there are high barriers to entry to the vendors market. For instance, if one supplier would be to a large extent or completely restricted from the EU, would the conditions be attractive for another supplier or other suppliers? That's one of the questions. And finally, BEREC will collect all this information to assess the current security level operators are thinking of and to which extent operators intend to adapt their policies in line with 5G toolbox. So operators should be asked how feasible it is to achieve a multi-vendor strategy which increase the security and resilience of network. And again, we do all this in close cooperation with other institutions like ENISA and within the NIS cooperation group. Just in conclusion, if we learned one thing from the COVID pandemic crisis, it's how crucial connectivity is within our society. And yet we should continue to build confidence in electronic communication networks and services, and especially in new technologies. Thank you very much. Over to you, Alexandre.
Thank you, Michel. And I mean, it was very interesting. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you. I suggest that we keep them all for the end. I think now that we've had the pan-European view, Andreas, would be very interesting to hear where Germany stands. I mean, Germany is a country which so far has shown extreme pragmatism, right? Being open to the world and yet be concerned about taking the necessary measures. So if you could let us know and tell us what the latest developments in Germany are.
Yeah, thank you very much. Andreas Konen, I'm the head of department in the Ministry of the Interior, and clearly, so for us, the question of IT security and cyber security is crucial in the 5G scenario. Actually, securing the upcoming 5G networks is a common challenge for all European countries, and the legislative competencies are located at the national level, since the security of the networks, and that applies to 5G too, is a matter of national security. Nevertheless, a coordinated approach of European level is elementary for a fast and effective and secure network rollout, And so the so-called EU 5G toolbox, which is the subject of today's panels, serves exactly for that purpose. But nevertheless, in Germany, those criteria and requirements for security of the 5G networks are currently being developed. This will be essentially in line with the EU 5G toolbox and will be implemented on different tracks. One track to implement the recommendations of the toolbox are technical requirements. The other ones to be implemented are requirements going towards the vendors. And so actually we have measures that are implemented in law on one hand, and we have measures that are implemented in security catalogs. And on the third hand, we have measures implemented in certification requirements. And let me start with those certification requirements. We will see that in a network, components have different roles, and especially 5G is a game changer for that. Components that are in the traditional 4G and 3G networks are only at the outer skirt of the networks, are not those important for the overall security and availability of the networks. That changes with 5G. We will have intelligent components also in the rim of the network. We will see that we have to find out which components are critical in supplying the service to the people. And so we came up with the term of critical components. And those critical components, that are the ones where we will ask for mandatory certification. Otherwise, such components can't be used in networks. That's in line with exactly what the EU toolbox asks for in the criteria and measures TM9 and TM10. The certification of components is intended to ensure that certain requirements and in particular security features have been implemented already by the vendor. So the technical requirements of certifications should result from a scheme under this Cybersecurity Act, so that as far as possible, uniform requirements and mutual recognition of the certificates will be possible in all member states that rely on those certificates. Furthermore, the catalog of security requirements for telecommunication networks is currently being revised in Germany, which will also take up various measures of the toolbox, and that corresponds exactly to what Michael already mentioned before. So actually, those requirements have to avoid monoculture, also mentioned by Michael. That means the SM05 and 06 requirements of the toolbox, as well as requirements for the introduction of security monitoring in the networks that was specified in TM5. So that's one end. Those are the technical requirements. But clearly, we have a strong discussion going on, not only in Germany, for the question whether a vendor can be trusted in. And so, actually, we have to look more carefully in the term high-risk vendors the 5G toolbox speaks of. And possibly, we have to implement more strategic measures devoted to the question, who is a high-risk vendor, how a high-risk vendor should be dealt with, and what can we do as a process if some vendor can't establish itself as a trustworthy vendor. So in Germany, this topic is held under the term trusted manufacturer. It is planned to create a new legal basis so that aspects of trustworthiness can be addressed adequately. And so a guarantee declaration is intended to outline certain aspects of this trustworthiness. In certain violations of this declaration, then it could be part of the ongoing process that prohibition of the use of the relevant critical components of such a non-trustworthy vendor could be spoken out, but only if we look at the devices carefully. It's an ex post declaration when we clearly can see that there's no trustworthiness given. Those trustworthiness checks and corresponding sanctions are contained in the current draft of the IT Security Law 2.0. That's at the moment currently under departmental coordination. So in the end, it's not clear what the exactly final wording of the regulation would be, but the general direction I explained to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. And so from an operator point of view, you're confronted with, and Andreas has explained to us, of course, that there are plans of trying to coordinate things between member states, and there would be mutual recognition of some certification standards. But for the time being, as we go, it strikes me that each member states, for the moment, is defining its own sets of rules. I'll grant you that uniformization is likely to happen at some stage, but for the time being, operators are therefore confronted to many different frameworks. So, Sara, how does an operator like Orange address these? Schizophrenic is probably too strong of a word, but at least this multiplicity of potentially applicable different rules.
Yes, thank you, Alexandre, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us to share our views on the 5G security toolbox. As you probably know, Orange is one of the largest operators in Europe for mobile and internet services. We're present in 7 EU member states currently, and investing, of course, heavily in fiber and rollout of cellular mobile networks. I think to start with just a bit of a recap, indeed, the COVID crisis has shown the essential importance of digital networks to ensure people can continue to communicate, work, share, learn, and also social distance from home, if you like. And I think while this crisis was unexpected, we have managed to cope quite well with the tremendous demands on our services and on our networks, from both a security perspective and also in being able to address the needs of whether it be our customers, public authorities, emergency services in dealing with the recent crisis. Specifically, our networks have remained very resilient, and indeed we've seen some phishing attacks recently. But to be honest, overall, we've done a pretty good job of making sure that all our networks and the connectivity we provide stand up. We're quite lucky to have and privileged to have dedicated resources for cybersecurity. We rely on 10 cyber SOCs in 13 countries across the world, 16 SOCs across the world in 13 different countries, 4 certs, and 3 scrubbing centers dealing with DDoS attacks. We also have a dedicated business unit, Orange Cyber Defense, who have over 2,000 cybersecurity experts working on a day-to-day basis for our own network security, but also for our customers, ensuring that they have the best-in-class services and secure services. Of course, all our security principles are based on 2 fundamental concepts. I don't think anybody would argue with this: is security by design and security by operation. And indeed, our different departments implicated in our network security and connectivity work hand in hand on a daily basis to ensure the ongoing security of our networks. And as a result, of course, security is part of our DNA as a company. And as in the deployment and the running of previous generations of cellular networks, 5G is going to be no exception. While our current networks have continued to be resilient, as I just said, the timely rollout of 5G networks will be key in supporting the continued digital transformation of the European Union, but also for the future competitiveness of the EU's economies and societies at large. As you said, Alexandre, we're, as a telecom sector, and I'm sure we are all very much aware, are subject to a multitude of security measures and obligations through different regulations at national level, notably. And indeed, what would we like to see is consistency in security measures and a certain level of predictability for operators, notably in the running up to 5G auctions, so that we know any impact that need to be taken into account can be assessed correctly. We, of course, welcome the 5G security toolbox, and especially the process it has set up in seeking to enhance the coordination and the encouraged harmonized approach with member states. Security, of course, is at the heart of our ongoing work to deploy 5G resilient infrastructure. And of course, anything that member states may wish to take as a measure, we believe needs to continue to be based on facts. Should be proportionate to the threats of which we're confronted and built on a solid understanding of the technological reality that we have at hand. I think what we're more concerned with would be if member states would take disproportionate actions or measures that could negatively impact the investment climate and which could in turn harm both Europe's competitiveness, but also the strategic position that Europe is aiming for in terms of 5G deployment. To ensure, notably, that we have the best possible solutions for our customers and our businesses and our economies, we do believe it's important that we pursue multi-vendor strategies so that we can rely on a diverse pool of suppliers, network suppliers, who can deliver high quality, secure, and affordable network equipment, all based on in the respect of pre-established security rules, of course. In terms of the implementation of the toolbox itself, however, what we're witnessing right now, and I think a number of my colleagues on the panel have alluded to this, we're seeing differing ways of implementing the toolbox in different member states. We've noticed from press releases and press announcements or even legal publications that probably almost a half of member states have not yet decided or published their concrete measures to be implemented for 5G security. Other member states appear to either be implementing regulatory measures to enable, for example, pre-authorization regimes, such as the case in France. And in other cases, like in Germany, you have the general security requirements being, of course, evaluated as Andreas established. There may be other member states, indeed, who may adopt a softer approach, going for something more coordinated with a monitoring of implementation. But in essence, today, we have one of our major presences, France, which is very clear. The rules of the game are clear. I think other countries where we're present, it is less clear at this point in time, and hence we're eager to get clarity to enable predictability going forward. So I guess at this stage, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you, Alexandre.
Thank you, Sara. These are actually all very interesting interventions, which prompted already a number of questions from the audience. So, I mean, but I'll use my privilege as chair to ask my question first. And I am, of course, I am deformed by my background as a lawyer. I believe in the rule of law. I am a dinosaur of telecoms because I've been in that space since 1990. And I can tell you that over the past 30 years, the focus of the legal work in telecom has been to try to move away from a certain subjectivity of the state, which had the propensity of trying to protect their national champions, trying to objectivize the ability for people to freely intervene on the market. And it's the best and most efficient company which got a chance to make the greatest inroads on the market. So this has been the focus of telecommunication regulation over the past 30 years. And one question I have for Michel, because you alluded to that, there is a certain tension between, on the one hand, cybersecurity for 5G networks, and on the other, operators' freedom. It's hard enough to be an operator. You need to be good commercially. You also need to have foresight in identifying the right equipment, the right provider. And on top of it now, you are likely to have some prescriptive rules adopted by government officials. And regardless of how clever, well-trained, and intelligent government officials can be, they do not have the experience that operators do. So to me, there is a profound tension between operators' freedom on the one hand and regulatory intervention. And I'd like to, and you alluded to both, Michel, in your presentation. So where do you strike as BEREC? Where do you think BEREC will strike the balance between the two?
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Yes, indeed, this is not easy to find the right balance. But let me tell you that during the last winter, we had a very intense dialogue with a lot of actors in the sectors. And we found that there are many challenges in the implementation just to find the right balance. Just let me give you an overview of the three main challenges we have identified. The first one is on validation and certification schemes. We think that, as we have heard that maybe it's very useful, but it won't solve every problem. We've seen some initiatives taken by operators in certification schemes or in threat information sharing at GSMA, called the Network Element Security Assurance Schemes. And additionally, operators have their own approach. So there is no silver bullet. What we see is that cooperation and information sharing mechanisms are key. Of course, repositories, best practices are useful, but some stakeholders are hoping for more guidance on the implementation of those standards, and the incident reporting processes need to be synchronized too. And there are many relevant authorities in each member states that share responsibilities. That's the first element to find the right balance. Another one, and of course, the previous panelists and especially Sara mentioned this. There are differences from countries to countries, and it depends on national circumstances. And of course, some of them have anticipated the relevant EU guidance, or they're not. Resources diverge from country to country, and so what's at stake is a kind of fragmentation in national initiatives, and that's a challenge we have identified together with operators. But let me finish by a third one. It's about coordination, cooperation, harmonization at EU level. Of course, you mentioned in your introduction, Alexandre, totally rightful. The EU has made a significant progress with the Cybersecurity Act, which has been updated last year. The NIS directive is implemented. The European Electronic Communications Code will be implemented by the end of the year. But even so, coordination and information sharing between European Commission, member states, and all relevant stakeholders, it needs to be deepened and ensured. And again, that's otherwise there is a risk of fragmentation. What we've heard is that for many telecom players, it is difficult to find a forum to exchange views in a broader EU setting. And we think at BEREC that maybe that BEREC can play a role, of course, together with ENISA, in order to find this right balance. Back to you, Alexandre.
Thank you, Michel. And this ties into one of the questions from the audience, basically, and you touched upon it, which I'd like to ask to Andreas, which is, you indicated that you're in the process of taking a number of measures from a certification and also from a legal point of view to define and clarify the space. Now, we all know by experience that once each country has defined its own rules, it's far more complicated to uniformize than if you take informal contacts up front before you define the rules to try to coordinate. How much of this informal coordination between countries is taking place during this preliminary phase that we are going through now of the definition of the various parameters? Is this something that you are only discussing at the national level with your key stakeholders in Germany, or it's something that you also share with other. And of course, I don't want to be you to disclose state secrets here, but I would assume that there are more ideas in two heads than in one, and so probably what other countries do may be of relevance.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. And actually, it has relevance to harmonize from the beginning. And it's actually not a secret. If you look into the process for certification under the certification framework, the CSA poses today, and it becomes clear that we have immediately to work together to get it into the rolling working program of ENISA, and that's something that we already started in parallel. We are talking to other countries. We are seeing what, for example, our French colleagues are doing. They have already implemented a procedure for dealing with different vendors and different products. And so clearly, in the end, the goal has to be to go immediately into harmonized schemes for certification, to get all the technical aspects working on one hand, to have them available as soon as possible, and most important, to define on a national basis steps towards implementing those harmonized measures. That will take some time. It will take some time to set up the schemes. It will take up some time to let the evaluation laboratories fly with those schemes. And clearly, for this time, we have to have an end on a national basis, some procedures that go towards that. And that's exactly what we are doing with the security catalog at our Federal Net Agency in Germany. We defined already steps in that catalog, giving time goals when to arrive at one or the other step. Same applies, much more difficult, to the question how to deal with the trustworthiness of vendors, because that's a question of national security. It gets really hard to harmonize that and to get some definition of critical, highly critical vendors that is accepted all over Europe, and not only in Europe, but also in all the other countries, especially those that are big players in the field of 5G coming from a user point and a vendor point. That's the hard job to do. The solution is very difficult in that area because that's based on national security issues, and so there are some necessary discussions to be done secretly first. For sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you very much, Alexandre.
Thank you. And Sara, I have for you a question also inspired by one of the comments of the audience, which is concretely how much of what you do in one country in terms of providing information to the competent bodies of the member states where you are present, how much are you able to reuse? Because from an operator point of view, it's very difficult to have, in your case, 7 different stories. So you would think that an operator like Orange is really looking for as much information as possible. And so are you playing is a big word, but are you really are you doing the part of your job to inform the various countries of what's being done abroad so that you can help also with the harmonization?
Hello. Yeah, thanks, Alexandre. Indeed, it is a complex issue for operators, specifically functioning in 7 different member states. That being said, the security measures are indeed, as the functioning of our networks happens at national level, have national concerns, are subject to national regulations, often based on EU regulation. And we do try, to the extent possible, to make sure that they're consistent from an overarching perspective. That being said, we respect all individual member state requirements, whether it be in reporting or other aspects.
Yeah. Okay. Another question that I have relates to the relationship between the EU here, and unfortunately it's the old EU minus the UK soon, and third countries, which will soon include the UK, as well as the rest of the world. And some of the operators in Europe are also present outside Europe. And they have procurement policies which are probably global. And so how do you reconcile, and how do you see the role of the EU here in terms of dealings with third countries? Maybe that's a question for Berek, because it's harmonization plus, if you will, Michel. And by way of background, for having worked across the world, much more than the influence of the American system, for instance, the European system has been used as a reference all over the world for regulating electronic communications. And I was wondering whether you anticipate a similar trend in terms of global procurement policies with third countries.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. This is not an easy question, of course, and especially not for Berek. Why is it so? As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, we are not on the driving seat. And Andreas, for instance, is more on the driving seat for his own country than we for Europe, but we are a passenger, an important passenger, and so we try to play a role. And of course, this is the kind of assessment we will try to make in our role. But again, this related to national sovereignty, and if there is an operator having a footprint outside Europe and submitted to other security requirements, it's not easy to find there a kind of common approach and to play the role as a model, as we have done, I think, and I may say so, in terms of privacy protection with GDPR. I think that we can export quite usefully the GDPR model in other regions of the world, like in the United States or in India or other regions. But for this, I'm not sure it will be as easy as we've done for the other example I just mentioned.
I think I agree, but probably again on this space, what Europe is doing is likely to have impacts outside the borders of Europe.
Sure.
Andreas, I don't know if you want to comment on this, since Michel put you on the spot. Well, it was quite complete.
This question is not so easy to answer, actually, and I would turn it around. Actually, at the moment, there is some strong influence of what happens in third countries to us. You only have to look to the United States and how they deal with the 5G issues, and the question how some vendors in Far East deal with the problem too. So actually we depend on those developments too, and we have to take into account that our approach going via technical criteria and certification may be in some sense overruled by the political decisions that have to be taken into account too. And so for me, it's really important that we have a political process running between a lot of countries, ideally, where we can at least discuss those questions, how to deal with high-risk vendors, for example, and what should be the measures that we take on in that case to give the providers in the end, the operators, some criteria at hand that are valid worldwide. That's at the moment, huge challenge to only go into that discussion. There's a process, you might know, and hopefully that's a place where we could continue on those questions.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now, on this point of Irish vendor, because it's clearly the elephant in the room. It's for having been in that space for a long time, I think this is a fairly intrusive rule that is proposed, when you think about it, legally, the EU law prohibits special rights, and special rights are rules that are limited to a few, allowing a few operators to operate in a certain space, but it amounts to creation of special rights. And obviously, high-risk vendors, depending on how they're identified, could result in some exclusion, in the exclusion of some operators and vendors, as opposed to others. But the question, which I mean, and I like your approach, Andreas, when you make a distinction between what is done at the administrative level and then the political debate. But in a part of the world where the rule of law prevails, you wonder whether there is room for the full catalog of measures that has been identified by the Commission. For instance, Michel opened his presentation by saying that it was important for him that you have some diversification, at least the possibility of a diversification of suppliers. Now, this can be done by through a number of measures. Interoperability is clearly one, and would seem to me to be the least intrusive measure. But then the next question becomes, do you need to combine this measure? Once you ensure interoperability, you also want to avoid that it's the least efficient operator that gets a guaranteed share of the pie, even though they are less effective. You want to make sure that to the extent that they become equally good, they can compete and start selling. And the question I have for the three of you here is whether you think there is in member states, you think that member states will implement the full catalog of measures, or whether they will apply some proportionality in their assessment of the need of a certain measure. And to the extent that you guarantee interoperability of equipment, for instance, then do you really need to do more than that and start labeling, subject to what is done in Germany, of course, in terms of certification, but do you need to engage into very strict high-risk vendor processes?
Ladies first.
Thank you. Thank you. From our perspective, indeed, it's very important that there be I think there's no one silver bullet, as Michael said earlier. There's going to be a basket of initiatives that will facilitate the implementation of the 5G security measures. A multitude of measures need to be done in parallel, whether it be indeed the risk assessments, certification schemes, maybe ensuring within the context, for example, of the review of the NIS directive, that we start looking at what we do with the hardware and software suppliers, as they are an integral part of the ecosystem going forward. And I think we need to ensure that that is secure. So that there is a basket of initiatives, but I think at all times we need to make sure we keep at the forefront that we need to maintain a competitive environment for suppliers. We need to ensure that there is choice on the market, and that we can ensure that we have secure and affordable networks going forward, which will stimulate our competitiveness and our place within the global landscape going forward. Thank you.
But so when I hear this, the natural follow-on conclusion is you'd rather to leave some market parameters at play rather than having too much political interference. And of course, the United States is the opposite example, where there is a fair amount of political interference, and sometimes not always very consistent. But as far as the EU is concerned, from what I hear, I mean, the conclusion that I draw from your intervention is that there is a high demand from operators to still retain some freedom, and as much freedom as you can, in the choice of your equipment, subject to certain parameters that are in the process of being defined.
I think the fact that we need to ensure competition in the European market is indeed viable. We need to ensure that there is the correct technological solution available that will deliver the security that we require across all networks. And to that extent, as long as that happens and we have predictable landscapes with the appropriate regulatory measures in place, that is good.
Now, if you allow me, and this is not a question, so you shouldn't fear my intrusion here, but it's more a personal reflection. When you talk to the Commission, and again, I'm talking from the point of view of a regulatory lawyer who does a lot of competition law and antitrust. Each time you talk to the Commission and the enforcers, they tell you, look, the markets are largely national across Europe. It's very unfortunate. I mean, we've seen why it's hard to merge, to go from 4 to 3 mergers, for instance, in the EU, because of national markets and traditional market definition. And so all that the European Commission has tried to stimulate, including through the adoption of the Electronic Communications Code, was to move towards pan-European markets and facilitate pan-European markets. And that was the purpose of the spectrum policy that is being that they try to change. Now, of course, the code ultimately ended up not being as ambitious as the original draft was, because member states naturally wants to retain control of spectrum. And spectrum is one of the reasons why markets are still compartmentalized along national borders. But one of the question I have is, to the extent that we're really trying to break those national barriers, to what extent is cybersecurity going to be one more layer of national regulation that will affect pan-European market definition and the ability of operators to really branch out and run networks seamlessly across Europe? And I do think that from a European policy point of view, and while I'm totally sensitive to the need of national security, which falls within the exclusive jurisdiction of member states, there's no question about that. But there should be a way to try to integrate the need for trying to decompartmentalize the European markets and try to make them more pan-European than they are today. And it would be, I mean, from my point of view, having those domestic rules will not facilitate the trend towards defining pan-European markets.
That's fully correct in some sense. And actually, cybersecurity lives from a harmonized approach. It's the same with consolidation of IT. If you have widespread IT departments in your company, and if you have different people responsible for it, you run into cybersecurity trouble. And the same is real for the market, telecommunications market in Europe. But the solution is actually to see somewhere else, in my opinion. It's a question we didn't discuss today so far. It's a question of European digital sovereignty. And the question, how many vendors do we have actually we can put trust in, because they are coming out of the European Union, and that needs some pressure. And with that, with digital sovereignty, cybersecurity comes automatically. It's in some kind the same business as harmonizing IT or harmonizing telecommunications on a functional basis.
That's correct. But I mean, I would think that where the balance is going to strike is that it's not going to be on the political front. I mean, it has to be through standardization and the definition of processes which are objective, transparent, and non-discriminatory. And of course, then everyone needs to meet those criteria. And to the extent that you meet those criteria, there is a then of course you start falling within the ambit of each national regulation. But I mean, it's quite surprising when you see where we're coming from. We come from an environment where in 1987, we started having the first liberalization directive on terminal equipment. The purpose of this was to make the market pan-European and for the supply of telecommunication equipment, the market has become pan-European, if not global. And now we are in an environment where we run the risk of having these equipment, at least in the short term, while each country is defining its own game plan from a network security point of view, where we are back to square one in the recreation of access limitations to countries, and I think this is I mean, I would be, from a conceptual point of view, it would be a very strange and odd outcome, considering the focus of EU regulation over the past 40 years in this space. Look, I'm mindful of the time, so we're going to have to wrap up. I don't know if I am not sure that I've seen any additional questions. So I think we're getting to the end of our presentation. Michel, Andreas, and Sara, I don't know if there are other comments or points that you wanted to make.
Not especially, no.
Well, thank you all for your very insightful thoughts and active participation. And it was nice meeting you or seeing you again on this occasion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting us, and have a good time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.